The autumn wind carried the scent of rain as Sarah hurried down Main Street toward the doctor's office, her heart pounding with urgency. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived alone on the edge of town, had taken a bad fall, and Dr. Webb was nowhere to be found. Someone had mentioned that he was delivering a baby at a ranch 20 miles away and wouldn't be back until morning. Sarah had some experience with medical emergencies from caring for her mother during her final illness, and she couldn't stand by while Mrs. Henderson suffered. But, as she reached the doctor's office, she found Mrs. Hutchinson blocking her way.
"And, just where do you think you're going?"
Mrs. Hutchinson demanded, her arms crossed over her chest. "Mrs. Henderson is hurt and needs help," Sarah replied, trying to step around the older woman. "Dr. Webb isn't here, so I'm going to do what I can for her."
Mrs. Hutchinson moved to block her again. "Absolutely not. We're not letting some mail-order bride with questionable credentials play doctor with one of our own."
"I'm not playing doctor," Sarah said firmly. "I have experience with injuries and illness.
Mrs.
Henderson needs immediate attention, and I'm the only one available who knows what to do." "You're not touching her," Mrs. Hutchinson declared. "We'll wait for Dr. Webb to return." "She could be seriously injured," Sarah protested.
"Waiting could make things worse."
Mrs. Hutchinson's smile was cold. "That's a risk we're willing to take rather than trust you."
Sarah felt a familiar rage building inside her.
For over a month, she had endured the constant hostility and suspicion of this woman and her followers. She had tried to prove herself through patience and good works, but nothing seemed to matter. Mrs. Hutchinson was determined to see her as a threat regardless of her actions. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, her voice rising. "An elderly woman is in pain, possibly seriously hurt, and you're willing to let her suffer because of your prejudice against me." "It's not prejudice when it's based on facts," Mrs. Hutchinson retorted. "We know what you are, Miss Morrison."
"We're not going to let you make things worse."
A crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the raised voices. Sarah could see the familiar faces of people who had been avoiding her for weeks, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. She realized that this moment would define her future in Cedar Ridge more than any other.
"What facts?"
Sarah demanded loudly, addressing not just Mrs. Hutchinson but the entire crowd.
"What exactly do you know about me that justifies this treatment?" Mrs. Hutchinson looked surprised by Sarah's direct challenge.
"We know you were dismissed from your job for stealing.
We know you associated with criminals. We know you're just like that Rebecca woman who robbed Jim Patterson."
"You know nothing," Sarah shot back, her patience finally exhausted. "You've taken fragments of truth and twisted them into lies because it suits your prejudices. Yes, I was dismissed from a factory job for taking fabric scraps that were destined for the trash. I needed them to mend my dying mother's clothes.
Yes, I knew a man named Charles Whitmore who some people called a gambler.
He helped me when my mother's former employer tried to cheat me out of her final wages. These are the crimes you've used to condemn me."
The crowd was silent now, listening despite themselves.
Sarah could see doubt creeping into some faces, but Mrs. Hutchinson wasn't finished.
"Pretty words," the older woman said dismissively.
"But actions speak louder.
Where's your proof that any of this is true? Where's your proof that it isn't?"
Sarah countered. "You've been spreading rumors and accusations for weeks, but you've never provided a single verified fact.
You've never shown these supposed sworn statements from Boston. You've never given anyone a chance to actually know me before judging me."
Mrs. Webb pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with worry.
"What's all this noise about?"
"I heard Mrs. Henderson was hurt."
"She is," Sarah said quickly.
"She fell and hit her head. She's been unconscious for almost an hour, and her breathing is shallow.
She needs medical attention immediately."
Dr. Webb's wife looked torn.
"My husband won't be back until tomorrow morning at the earliest."
"I can help her," Sarah said urgently. "I cared for my mother through months of illness. I know how to assess injuries and provide basic treatment."
"But, Mrs. Hutchinson won't let me near her."
Mrs. Webb looked between Sarah and Mrs. Hutchinson, clearly struggling with the decision.
Martha, if Harold isn't available and Mrs. Henderson is badly hurt. We are not trusting this woman with Agnes Henderson's life, Mrs. Hutchinson declared firmly.
I don't care what experience she claims to have. Then, Agnes might die, said a quiet voice from the back of the crowd.
Everyone turned to see Jake Morrison pushing through the gathered people.
His face was grim as he approached the group, and Sarah noticed that his clothes were dusty from hard riding.
Jake, where have you been? Mrs. Webb asked.
At the Henderson place, he replied. I found Agnes on her kitchen floor and rode to town as fast as I could to get help. She's in bad shape, and she's getting worse. Mrs. Hutchinson lifted her chin defiantly.
Then, we'll take her to Dr. Webb in the morning. Jake's eyes flashed with anger. She might not live until morning, Martha. And, you know it.
That's not our decision to make, Mrs. Hutchinson replied coldly.
It's exactly our decision to make, Jake shot back. Agnes Henderson has been a member of this community for 40 years.
She helped deliver half the children in this town and nursed the other half through childhood illnesses. And now you're willing to let her die because you're too proud and prejudiced to accept help from someone you don't approve of.
The crowd was shifting uncomfortably now.
Sarah could see that Jake's words were having an impact. Mrs. Henderson was indeed beloved in the community, and the thought of losing her due to petty prejudices was clearly troubling many people.
Mrs. Sterling spoke up hesitantly.
Jake, we understand your concern, but we can't just trust someone we don't know with something so important. You don't know her because you've refused to get to know her, Jake replied sharply. For 6 weeks, Sarah Morrison has been living quietly on Thomas's ranch, working hard, attending church, and bothering no one. But, instead of giving her a chance, you've listened to Martha's poison and treated her like a criminal. He turned to address the entire crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being respected.
How many of you have actually spoken to Miss Morrison? How many have taken the time to form your own opinions instead of accepting Martha's gossip as fact? The silence was telling. Sarah could see people looking down at their feet, unwilling to meet Jake's challenging gaze.
I thought so, Jake continued. You've condemned a woman you don't know based on rumors and fear. Meanwhile, Agnes Henderson is dying while you debate whether to let Miss Morrison help her. Mrs. Hutchinson's face was red with anger.
Jake Morrison, you don't understand what kind of woman this is. She's dangerous.
The only dangerous thing here is ignorance and prejudice, Jake replied coldly.
Miss Morrison, are you willing to help Agnes despite how these people have treated you? Sarah didn't hesitate.
Of course.
If you'll take me to her. Absolutely not, Mrs. Hutchinson declared. I forbid it.
Jake stepped closer to Mrs. Hutchinson, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Martha, you don't own this town, and you don't own the people in it. Agnes Henderson is my neighbor and my friend, and I'll be damned if I let you murder her with your pride. How dare you, Mrs. Hutchinson gasped.
How dare I what? Stand up for what's right? Refuse to let a good woman die because you're too stubborn to admit you might be wrong?
Jake's voice was rising now, and Sarah could see the barely controlled anger in his eyes.
You've spent weeks destroying Miss Morrison's reputation based on gossip and lies. You've turned this community against an innocent woman because it makes you feel powerful. Well, I've had enough.
He turned back to the crowd, his voice carrying across the entire gathering.
Agnes Henderson is dying. Dr. Webb won't be back until tomorrow. Miss Morrison has medical experience and is willing to help.
Anyone who tries to stop her from providing aid to a member of our community will answer to me personally. The threat was clear, and everyone knew that Jake Morrison was not a man to make idle promises. He was respected throughout the county as a fair but formidable man, and his word carried weight with most people.
Mrs. Webb stepped forward hesitantly.
If Miss Morrison is truly willing to help, and if she has experience. She does, Thomas's voice came from behind the crowd.
Sarah turned to see him approaching, having apparently just arrived in town.
Sarah cared for her mother through months of serious illness. She knows more about medical care than most people in this town." Mrs. Hutchinson looked around the crowd desperately, seeking support, but Sarah could see that the tide was turning. The combination of Jake's passionate defense and the real threat to Mrs. Henderson's life was making people reconsider their positions. "Fine," Mrs. Hutchinson said through gritted teeth. "But, if anything happens to Agnes, it's on your heads." Jake was already moving toward his horse. "Sarah, can you ride?" "Yes," she replied, though she hadn't been on a horse in years. "Thomas, can you spare a horse for her?" "Of course," Thomas said quickly. "I'll get one ready." 20 minutes later, Sarah was riding hard across the prairie beside Jake Morrison, her medical bag bouncing against her side. She had put together some basic supplies from Dr. Webb's office, though she hoped she wouldn't need most of them. "Thank you," she said as they rode. "For defending me back there." Jake glanced at her, his face serious. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was right." "Still, you didn't have to stand up to Mrs. Hutchinson so publicly." "You made enemies today." "Martha Hutchinson was already my enemy," Jake replied grimly. "She's been trying to control this town for years, and it was time someone called her on it." They rode in silence for a while, the horses' hooves drumming against the hard ground. Sarah was nervous about what she would find when they reached Mrs. Henderson's house, but she was also feeling something else: hope. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she felt like she might have a real ally. When they reached the Henderson place, Sarah quickly assessed the elderly woman's condition. Mrs. Henderson was unconscious, with a significant head injury and signs of internal bleeding. It was serious, but not hopeless. Working by lamplight, Sarah cleaned and bandaged the head wound, checked for broken bones, and positioned Mrs. Henderson to help with her breathing. Jake assisted quietly, following her instructions without question. "Will she be all right?" he asked when Sarah finally sat back from her work. "I think so," Sarah replied carefully. "She needs Dr. Webb to confirm there's no internal damage, but I've done what I can. She should be more comfortable now, and her vital signs are improving." Jake nodded, relief visible on his face. "Agnes helped deliver me when I was born. She's like family." They took turns watching Mrs. Henderson through the night, and, by morning, the elderly woman was conscious and asking for water. When Dr. Webb arrived with the sunrise, he examined Sarah's work and nodded approvingly. "Excellent care," he said quietly. "You probably saved her life." Word spread quickly through Cedar Ridge about what had happened. By the time Sarah returned to town with Jake and Dr. Webb, a small crowd had gathered at the doctor's office. Mrs. Henderson was awake and talking, clearly going to make a full recovery. Mrs. Hutchinson was notably absent from the crowd, but several other people approached Sarah with expressions ranging from sheepish to genuinely grateful. "Miss Morrison," Mrs. Sterling said hesitantly, "I owe you an apology." "We all do. You saved Agnes's life, and we almost prevented you from helping her." Other voices joined in, people admitting that they had been wrong to judge her so harshly. Sarah accepted their apologies graciously, though she couldn't help but notice that their acceptance was based on her proving her worth rather than on recognizing her basic human dignity. Over the following weeks, Sarah's position in the community gradually improved. People who had avoided her before began nodding politely when they passed on the street. Shop owners served her without reluctance. Even some of Mrs. Hutchinson's closest allies began to distance themselves from the older woman's vendetta. Mrs. Hutchinson herself became increasingly isolated as people began to question her judgment and motives. The revelation that her sworn statements from Boston had been largely fabricated destroyed her credibility, and her attempt to let Mrs. Henderson die rather than accept help from Sarah had shocked many people. 2 months after the incident at Mrs. Henderson's house, Sarah and Thomas were married in a simple ceremony at the church. Jake Morrison stood as Thomas's best man, and Mrs. Henderson, fully recovered from her injuries, insisted on providing the wedding cake. As Sarah stood beside Thomas, exchanging vows in front of a community that had once rejected her, she reflected on how much had changed. She had come to Cedar Ridge hoping for acceptance, but instead she had found something more valuable: the knowledge that true dignity came from within, not from others' opinions. Jake's defense of her had been the turning point, but Sarah knew that the real victory had been her refusal to let prejudice and cruelty break her spirit. She had faced down the worst that small-town hatred could offer and had emerged stronger for it. Mrs. Hutchinson attended the wedding, sitting in the back of the church with a sour expression. But her power to hurt Sarah was broken, and everyone knew it. The woman who had once seemed so formidable now appeared petty and small. After the ceremony, as the community celebrated with food and music in the church hall, Jake approached the new couple. "Congratulations," he said simply, shaking Thomas's hand and nodding to Sarah.
"Thank you," Sarah replied. "For everything." Jake smiled slightly.
"You earned your place here, Sarah.
You just needed someone to give you the chance to prove it."
As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself surrounded by people who had once shunned her, now eager to welcome her into their community. She thought about her mother's words about courage, and she realized that her mother had been right. She had found the strength to stand up for herself when it mattered most. Looking across the room at Thomas, who was laughing with his neighbors, and at Jake, who was quietly making sure everyone had enough to eat, Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment. She had traveled across the country looking for a new life, and, despite all the obstacles, she had found exactly what she had been seeking. The mail-order bride who had been shamed and rejected had become Sarah Brennan, a respected member of the community. And, more importantly, she had learned that true dignity could never be taken away by others, it could only be surrendered by oneself. As the celebration continued around her, Sarah smiled and began planning the life she would build with Thomas in this place that had finally become home. The woman who had stepped off the train in fear and hope had found both belonging and the courage to fight for it when necessary. Mrs. Hutchinson's poison had lost its power, replaced by the simple truth that character was revealed through actions, not assumptions. And Sarah's actions had spoken louder than any words could ever have done. The morning sun was just breaking over the eastern hills when Sarah heard the sound of approaching horses. She looked up from the vegetable garden she had been weeding, shading her eyes against the golden light. 3 riders were coming down the track toward the house, and she recognized Mrs. Hutchinson's distinctive black mare. Thomas emerged from the barn where he had been feeding the cattle, his face grim as he watched the approaching riders. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the house, her heart already racing. Mrs. Hutchinson rarely went anywhere without a purpose, and that purpose was rarely good. The 3 women reined in their horses near the front porch. Besides Mrs. Hutchinson, there was Mrs. Caroline Webb, the doctor's wife, and Mrs. Ruth Sterling, who ran the town's only boarding house. All 3 were pillars of Cedar Ridge society, and all 3 looked at Sarah with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. "Thomas," Mrs. Hutchinson called out, not bothering to dismount. "We need to have a word with you." Thomas walked over slowly, his jaw set. "What can I do for you ladies?" Mrs. Hutchinson's eyes flicked toward Sarah before settling on Thomas. "We've come as friends, Thomas, to warn you about something important." Sarah felt her stomach clench. She had been living on the ranch for 2 weeks now, and, while things with Thomas were going well, the hostility from the townspeople had only grown worse. Every trip to town brought new whispers and cold stares. "What kind of warning?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Mrs. Webb leaned forward in her saddle. "Thomas, we've been asking around about your Miss Morrison. Writing letters to Boston, making inquiries." "What kind of inquiries?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice stronger than she felt. Mrs. Hutchinson smiled coldly. "The kind that reveal the truth about people who run away from their past. We found some very interesting information." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She had told Thomas about her parents' deaths and the debts that had forced her to leave Boston, but she hadn't told him everything. There were some details she had hoped to share gradually, when they knew each other better. "What are you talking about, Martha?" Thomas's voice carried a warning, but Mrs. Hutchinson was clearly enjoying herself too much to stop. "Your precious mail-order bride wasn't just some innocent orphan looking for a new start," Mrs. Hutchinson announced triumphantly. She was working as a seamstress in a factory, but she was dismissed for stealing fabric. The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. It was true that she had been dismissed from the textile factory, but not for stealing. She had been caught taking scraps of fabric that were destined for the trash, planning to use them to mend her mother's worn dresses. The factory owner had called it theft, though the fabric was worthless remnants. "That's not the whole truth," Sarah said quickly, but Mrs. Hutchinson cut her off.
"And that's not all," the older woman continued relentlessly.
"She was also seen in the company of a known gambler named Charles Whitmore, who disappeared from Boston the same week she left."
"Quite a coincidence, don't you think?"
Thomas looked at Sarah sharply. Charles Whitmore had indeed been a gambler, but he had also been a kind man who had helped Sarah arrange her journey west when her mother's former employer tried to cheat her out of her final wages. Charles had disappeared because he was being pursued by men he owed money to, not because he was involved with Sarah romantically.
Mrs. Sterling spoke up for the first time. "Thomas, we're telling you this because we care about you.
This woman has a history of associating with criminals and thieves.
She's dangerous."
Sarah felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall.
"Those accusations are based on half-truths and gossip.
If you really wanted to help Thomas, you would have asked me directly instead of spreading lies." Mrs. Hutchinson laughed harshly.
"Lies? We have sworn statements from people in Boston who knew you. People who warned us that you were trouble." "What people?" Sarah demanded. "Give me their names." "That's not important, Mrs.
Hutchinson replied smoothly. "What's important is that Thomas knows what kind of woman he's brought into his home." Thomas had been silent throughout the exchange, his face unreadable. Now he stepped closer to the mounted women, his voice quiet but firm. "Ladies, I appreciate your concern, but Sarah and I can work out our own affairs." Mrs. Webb shook her head sadly.
"Thomas, you're a good man, but you're being fooled. Just like Jim Patterson was fooled. This woman will take everything you have and disappear in the night."
"She's already been here 2 weeks," Mrs. Sterling added. "Long enough to learn where you keep your money and what you own."
"How do you know she's not planning her escape right now?"
Sarah saw Thomas glance at her, and, for a horrible moment, she thought she saw doubt in his eyes. The carefully constructed trust they had been building over the past 2 weeks felt suddenly fragile, threatened by the poison these women were spreading. "I know because I'm not that kind of person," Sarah said firmly. "I came here hoping to build a life with Thomas, not to rob him." Mrs. Hutchinson's smile was cruel.
"That's exactly what Rebecca told Jim Patterson. Right up until she disappeared with his money."
The women rode away after extracting a promise from Thomas that he would think carefully about what they had told him. As their horses disappeared over the hill, Sarah and Thomas stood in awkward silence, the morning that had started so peacefully now ruined.
"Is any of it true?" Thomas asked finally. Sarah took a deep breath. "Some of it.
I was dismissed from the factory, but not for stealing valuable fabric. I took scraps that were going to be thrown away to mend my mother's clothes. And I did know Charles Whitmore, but not the way they made it sound. He helped me when my mother's employer tried to cheat me."
Thomas nodded slowly. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?"
"Because I knew how it would sound," Sarah admitted. "I was afraid you would judge me based on circumstances rather than character." They talked for another hour, with Sarah explaining the full details of her life in Boston and the events that had led to her departure. Thomas listened without interrupting, and, when she finished, he was quiet for a long time.
"I believe you," he said finally.
"But, Sarah, this is going to make things harder for both of us.
Mrs. Hutchinson won't let this go."
He was right. Over the following days, the hostility in town grew even worse. When Sarah walked down Main Street, conversations stopped and people openly stared. Shop owners were reluctant to serve her, and children pointed and whispered. The situation came to a head the following Sunday at church. Sarah had been attending services with Thomas, hoping to show the community that she was a respectable woman. But, this Sunday, Reverend Palmer stood up before the congregation and began speaking about the dangers of moral corruption. "We must be vigilant," he said, his eyes finding Sarah in the crowd, "against those who would bring sin and dishonesty into our community. The Bible tells us that we shall know them by their fruits." Sarah felt every eye in the church turn toward her. The message was clear: she was the moral corruption the Reverend was warning against. Her cheeks burned with shame and anger, but she kept her head high. After the service, as people filed out of the church, Mrs. Hutchinson approached her directly.
"Miss Morrison, I think it would be best for everyone if you returned to Boston. Clearly, you don't belong here." "I think that's for Thomas and me to decide," Sarah replied evenly. "Is it?"
Mrs. Hutchinson looked around at the gathered crowd.
"Tell me, how many people here want you to stay?" The silence was deafening.
Sarah looked around at faces that ranged from hostile to simply uncomfortable, but no one spoke up in her defense.
Even Thomas seemed uncertain, caught between his growing feelings for Sarah and the pressure from his community.
Mrs. Webb stepped forward.
"Miss Morrison, we're not trying to be cruel. But you have to understand that your presence here is disruptive.
People are uncomfortable, and that's not good for anyone." "I haven't done anything wrong," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger.
"I've been respectful and helpful. I've attended church and tried to be a good neighbor.
But you've all decided to hate me based on gossip and lies."
"It's not gossip when we have proof," Mrs. Hutchinson snapped. "We know what kind of woman you are."
"No," said a quiet voice from behind them.
"You don't." Everyone turned to see Jake Morrison approaching.
He had been standing near his horse, apparently ready to leave, but now he walked toward the group with purposeful strides.
"Jake, this doesn't concern you," Mrs. Hutchinson said dismissively. "Doesn't it?" Jake's voice was calm but carried an undertone of steel.
"You're attacking a woman's character based on rumors and half-truths.
That concerns any decent person." Mrs. Webb frowned.
"Jake, we understand you want to support your neighbors, but you don't know this woman's history." "I know what I've observed," Jake replied. "I've seen her working in Thomas's garden, mending his clothes, and caring for his animals while he's been out with the cattle.
I've seen her attend church every Sunday and treat everyone with respect, even when they don't return it." Sarah stared at Jake in surprise.
She hadn't realized he had been watching her so closely, or that he had formed any opinion about her character.
Mrs. Hutchinson's face was growing red. "Jake Morrison, you're being fooled just like Thomas. This woman is dangerous."
"The only thing dangerous here is the way you've been spreading poison through this community," Jake replied sharply.
"You've decided to destroy this woman's reputation based on gossip from people who don't even live here."
"We have sworn statements," Mrs. Sterling protested.
"From whom?" Jake asked. "Name these people who supposedly know so much about Miss Morrison's character."
The women exchanged glances, and Sarah realized that Jake had identified a weak point in their accusations. They had claimed to have statements from people in Boston, but they had never provided names or details. Mrs. Hutchinson lifted her chin defiantly. "We don't have to justify our sources to you, Jake Morrison."
"Actually, you do," Jake said calmly. "When you're trying to destroy someone's reputation, you need proof. Real proof, not just gossip and assumptions."
He turned to face the crowd of onlookers.
"How many of you have actually seen Miss Morrison do anything dishonest or inappropriate?"
The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sarah realized that Jake was forcing people to confront the fact that their hostility was based on fear and prejudice, not evidence. "She associates with criminals," Mrs. Webb said weakly. "She helped a man who was in trouble," Jake corrected.
"That sounds like Christian charity to me."
"She was fired for stealing," Mrs. Sterling added. "She took fabric scraps that were being thrown away," Jake replied.
"To help her dying mother." Again, that sounds more like desperation than criminality.
Sarah felt a rush of gratitude toward Jake, but she also noticed the angry looks he was receiving from Mrs. Hutchinson and her allies. By defending her, he was making enemies of the most influential people in town.
Mrs. Hutchinson's voice turned cold. "Jake Morrison, you're making a mistake defending this woman.
When she shows her true colors, don't come crying to us."
"I won't," Jake said simply.
"Because I believe Miss Morrison is exactly what she appears to be, a decent woman trying to make a new life in difficult circumstances."
As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah approached Jake hesitantly. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for speaking up. You didn't have to do that." Jake touched his hat brim. "Yes, I did. What they were doing wasn't right."
Thomas joined them, his face troubled.
"Jake, I appreciate what you did, but this is going to make things harder for all of us."
"Probably," Jake agreed.
"But sometimes doing the right thing is hard." That evening, as Sarah and Thomas sat on their porch watching the sunset, they talked about what had happened at church.
"Jake took a big risk today," Thomas said.
"Mrs. Hutchinson has a lot of influence in this town.
She can make life difficult for people who cross her."
Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Maybe I should leave. I never wanted to cause problems for you or anyone else."
Thomas reached over and took her hand.
"Sarah, I don't want you to leave.
What Jake said today was right. You've been nothing but helpful and respectful since you arrived.
The problem isn't with you, it's with people who prefer gossip to truth."
"But if the whole town turns against us, then we'll face it together," Thomas said firmly. "I'm not going to let Martha Hutchinson dictate my life or my choices." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Jake Morrison's unexpected defense had shown her that not everyone in Cedar Ridge was against her.
And Thomas's support meant more than he could know.
But she also knew that Mrs. Hutchinson wasn't finished with her yet. The older woman's hatred had been clearly visible today, and Sarah suspected that worse attacks were coming. She would need all her courage to face whatever came next, and she hoped that Jake Morrison's example might inspire others to look beyond their prejudices and see her for who she really was. The fight for her place in this community was far from over, but for the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Sarah felt like she might have a chance to win it. The train whistle pierced the morning air as it pulled into Cedar Ridge Station, black smoke billowing against the pale blue sky. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Through the grimy window, she could see the dusty platform where a handful of people waited, their faces curious and unwelcoming. She had traveled for 6 days from Boston, leaving behind everything she had ever known. The letter in her reticule, now creased from countless readings, promised a new life with Thomas Brennan, a cattle rancher who needed a wife. Their correspondence had been brief but hopeful. He seemed kind in his letters, mentioning his small ranch and his dream of building something lasting in the Colorado Territory. As the train shuddered to a stop, Sarah smoothed her dark blue traveling dress and checked her reflection in the window. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath a simple hat, and her green eyes held determination despite her fears. She was 23, old enough to know her mind, but young enough to hope for happiness. The conductor helped her down from the car, and she stood on the platform with her single trunk, scanning the faces for Thomas Brennan. A tall man with sandy hair and kind blue eyes stepped forward, removing his hat.
"Miss Morrison?"
His voice carried a slight Irish accent.
"I'm Thomas Brennan." Relief flooded through her.
He looked exactly as he had described himself in his letters, and his smile seemed genuine.
"Mr. Brennan, yes. Thank you for meeting me."
Before Thomas could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air.
"Well, I'll be." Another mail-order bride stepping off the train like she owns the place.
Sarah turned to see a woman in her 40s, dressed in expensive dark silk, standing with 2 other ladies. The woman's eyes were cold and calculating as they looked Sarah up and down.
"Mrs. Hutchinson," Thomas said stiffly. "This is Miss Morrison."
"Oh, I know exactly what she is," Mrs. Hutchinson replied, her voice dripping with disdain. "Another desperate woman who couldn't find a husband back east, so she comes here to trick some poor rancher into marriage." The other women nodded in agreement, their faces showing barely concealed disgust. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin up. She had expected some judgment, but the open hostility surprised her. "Martha, that's enough," Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning.
Mrs. Hutchinson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Thomas, you poor man. Don't you see what's happening here?
These women are nothing but trouble. Mark my words, she'll take whatever you have and leave you broken."
Sarah's hands trembled slightly, but she found her voice.
Mrs. Hutchinson, I understand your concern, but you don't know anything about me or my circumstances.
Don't I?
Mrs. Hutchinson stepped closer, her eyes narrow.
Let me guess.
Your family lost their money, or maybe there was some scandal. No decent woman leaves everything behind to marry a stranger unless she's running from something. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Mrs. Hutchinson wasn't entirely wrong about her circumstances, though her assumptions about Sarah's character were cruel and unfair. Sarah's father had died in a factory accident, leaving debts that consumed everything they owned. Her mother had died of consumption the following winter, leaving Sarah alone with nothing but her education and her determination.
That's quite enough, Martha.
The voice belonged to an elderly man who approached with a walking stick. The young lady just arrived.
Show some Christian charity. Mrs. Hutchinson's mouth tightened.
Reverend Palmer, you're too trusting. These mail-order marriages rarely work. The woman takes advantage of lonely men, and the whole community suffers for it. I've seen plenty of arranged marriages work out fine, the Reverend replied calmly.
Love can grow between good people who respect each other.
Thomas stepped closer to Sarah, and she was grateful for his presence.
Miss Morrison, let's get your trunk loaded. We have a long ride to the ranch.
As Thomas lifted her trunk onto his wagon, Sarah heard Mrs. Hutchinson speaking loudly to her companions.
Just watch.
Within a month, she'll have spent all his money on fancy dresses and jewelry. These women know how to manipulate men. Sarah wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had never owned a fancy dress in her life and had no interest in jewels. But she sensed that anything she said would only make things worse. Instead, she allowed Thomas to help her up onto the wagon seat. As they drove away from the station, Thomas glanced at her apologetically.
I'm sorry about that. Mrs. Hutchinson thinks she runs this town.
Her husband owns the bank, so people listen to her more than they should.
It's not your fault, Sarah said quietly.
I suppose I should have expected some resistance. Thomas guided the horses down the main street of Cedar Ridge. It was a small town, maybe 300 people, with a general store, saloon, church, and a few other businesses. Several people stopped what they were doing to stare at them as they passed. Sarah felt like she was on display, and not in a good way.
The town's not usually so unwelcoming, Thomas explained.
We had another mail-order bride come through last year. Things didn't go well, and it left people suspicious.
What happened? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know.
Thomas was quiet for a moment.
Her name was Rebecca.
She married Jim Patterson, who owns the feed store. Within 2 weeks, she had talked him into giving her money to buy supplies for what she called improvements to the store. Then, she disappeared one night, taking everything she could carry.
Sarah's heart sank. I see why people might be cautious.
The thing is, Jim was so embarrassed that he never reported it to the sheriff. He just told people she got homesick and left. But Mrs. Hutchinson figured out what really happened, and she's been warning everyone about mail-order brides ever since. They left the town behind and rode through rolling hills covered with grass and scattered trees. The landscape was beautiful but harsh, and Sarah could see why it might be lonely for a man working a ranch by himself. The air was thin and clear, and the sky seemed bigger than any sky she had ever seen. Tell me about your ranch, she said, wanting to change the subject.
Thomas's face brightened.
It's not much yet, but I've been building it up for 3 years. I have about 200 head of cattle and 30 horses. The house is small, but it's solid. I built it myself.
Do you have help with the cattle?
I hire a few men during roundup and branding, but mostly I work alone. That's part of why I... He paused, looking embarrassed.
Why I wrote to you.
The work is hard, and the loneliness is harder.
Sarah appreciated his honesty. I understand.
I was alone after my mother died. Loneliness can be the worst kind of pain.
They talked quietly as the wagon rolled along the dusty road.
Thomas pointed out landmarks and told her about his neighbors.
Most were good people, he said, though they tended to be suspicious of outsiders. Sarah began to relax slightly. Thomas seemed genuinely kind, and, despite the hostile reception in town, she felt hopeful about their future together. The sun was high overhead when they finally turned down a narrow track that led to Thomas's ranch. Sarah could see a small wooden house with a covered porch, a barn, and several corrals. It was simple but well-maintained, and she could see the care Thomas had put into building his home. As they approached the house, a rider appeared on the ridge above them. Thomas squinted against the sun and waved. "That's Jake Morrison, my nearest neighbor." "No relation to you, I expect, though it's interesting you have the same name." The rider approached, and Sarah could see he was a man in his 30s with dark hair and serious brown eyes. He sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, and there was something commanding about his presence. "Thomas," the man said, touching his hat brim. "Miss Morrison, I presume?" "Jake, this is Sarah Morrison," Thomas said. "Sarah, Jake owns the Double R Ranch, about 5 miles north of here." Jake studied Sarah for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was measuring her character with those steady brown eyes. "Welcome to Colorado, Miss Morrison. I hope you'll be happy here." "Thank you," Sarah replied, uncertain whether his words were genuine or merely polite. "Any trouble in town?" Jake asked Thomas, and Sarah realized that the question wasn't casual curiosity. Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. Mrs. Hutchinson was her usual charming self. Jake nodded grimly. "I figured she might be. She's been telling anyone who'll listen that mail-order brides are a plague on decent society." "It doesn't matter what she thinks," Thomas said firmly. "Sarah and I will make our own way." Jake looked at Sarah again, and this time she thought she saw approval in his eyes. "I'm sure you will. If you need anything, Miss Morrison, the Double R is always ready to help neighbors." After Jake rode away, Thomas helped Sarah down from the wagon and showed her into the house. It was small but clean, with a main room that served as kitchen and sitting area, and 2 smaller rooms for sleeping. The furniture was simple but well-made, and Sarah could see that Thomas had tried to make the place welcoming. "I know it's not what you're used to," he said apologetically. "It's lovely," Sarah replied, and she meant it. The house felt like a home, something she hadn't had in a long time. "You've done beautiful work." Over the next few days, Sarah settled into life on the ranch. Thomas was respectful and kind, giving her space to adjust while sharing his daily routines with her. They talked easily, and Sarah began to feel hopeful that their marriage could become something real and lasting. But their peace was shattered when they went to town for supplies the following Saturday. Sarah had dressed carefully in her best dress, hoping to make a better impression than she had at the train station. She and Thomas walked into the general store together, and Sarah noticed immediately how the conversation stopped when people saw her. Mrs. Hutchinson was there with 2 other women, examining bolts of fabric. She looked up when Sarah entered, and her expression turned cold. "Well, well. If it isn't the new Mrs. Brennan. Or should I say, the woman calling herself Mrs. Brennan?" Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her, but she kept her voice steady. "We haven't married yet, Mrs. Hutchinson. We're getting to know each other first." Mrs. Hutchinson laughed nastily. "How convenient. Easy to change your mind when you find out he doesn't have as much money as you hoped." "Martha, leave it alone," said the store owner, Mr. Peterson. But his voice lacked conviction, and Sarah could see that he was uncomfortable with her presence too. "I will not leave it alone, Mrs. Hutchinson declared loudly. "This woman is exactly like that Rebecca person who robbed poor Jim Patterson. Look at her, putting on airs with that fancy dress, already planning how to spend Thomas's money." Sarah's cheeks burned. The dress wasn't fancy at all, it was simply the best she owned. But she could see that several people in the store were nodding along with Mrs. Hutchinson's words. "She's probably already planning her escape," Mrs. Hutchinson continued. "These mail-order brides are all the same. They come here with sob stories about being alone and needy, but they're really just con artists looking for easy targets." "That's enough," Thomas said angrily, stepping forward.
But Mrs. Hutchinson wasn't finished.
Mark my words, Thomas Brennan.
Within a month, she'll have found some excuse to leave, and she'll take everything you've worked for with her.
These women have no shame, no dignity, no honor.
The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Around the store, she could see people watching the confrontation with interest, and she realized that Mrs. Hutchinson's accusations were taking root in their minds. She was being judged and condemned based on the actions of one dishonest woman she had never met. Sarah wanted to defend herself, to explain her true circumstances and her genuine hopes for building a life with Thomas. But she could see in the faces around her that many people had already made up their minds. Mrs. Hutchinson's poison was spreading, and Sarah felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. As they left the store with their supplies, Sarah noticed that several people were whispering and pointing at her. She held her head high, but inside, she felt her hopes beginning to crumble. How could she build a life in a place where she would always be seen as a threat and a fraud? Thomas was quiet on the ride home, and Sarah wondered if Mrs. Hutchinson's words were affecting him too. The doubt and suspicion in town were like a disease, spreading from person to person, and Sarah feared that eventually, even Thomas might begin to question her motives. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind across the prairie, Sarah wondered if she had made a terrible mistake coming to Colorado. She had hoped for a new beginning, but instead, she found herself trapped in a web of suspicion and hostility that seemed to grow stronger each day. She thought about her mother's last words, "Be strong, Sarah. You have more courage than you know." But, as she faced the challenges ahead, Sarah wasn't sure courage would be enough to overcome the prejudice and fear that surrounded her. The moon shone through her window, casting silver light across the floor, and Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would not let Mrs. Hutchinson's cruelty drive her away. She would prove that not all mail-order brides were dishonest, and she would earn her place in this community through hard work and integrity. But, as she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her real battles were just beginning, and she had no idea who she could count on to stand beside her when the fighting got fierce.